guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to talk about the American legend, the legendary Jim Bowie knife. We're going to talk about the one I have. I've had a couple over the years, and we're going to talk about the history of it, and I'm going to give you a little modern day application and why I think this knife is not dead. Stay tuned. Okay, so the history on this knife, if you do not know, it became famous by a man named Jim Bowie from Tennessee, Kentucky area, my homeland, and it got really famous because of him, the Alamo, some fights, the American-Mexican War, and we're going to talk about how it morphed between that into the frontiersman and why it is one of the most iconic knives when you think North America, backwoodsman, frontiersman, taming the wild, taming the Rockies, why this knife, I think, has led such a massive imprint on culture and American folklore. So I'm just going to show you guys here a few pictures and some stuff of some Bowie knives, some of the ones that people think no one has the original Bowie knife, but we're going to get into that a little bit later. And I'm going to tell you which one I think is probably the most accurate for the knife he probably used in the sandbar fight, and why I think the one that supposedly legend was recovered at the Alamo was not the same knife from the sandbar fight, and just kind of a conspiracy theory on that knife. So Jim Bowie was born in 1796. He grew up in the Tennessee, Kentucky, Hopkinsville, Kentucky area, kind of the same area in the general vicinity neck of the woods that I grew up in. He was known for being a frontiersman, a soldier. He had some close companions with some of Tennessee's first politicians, and that kind of, works its way into, how he ended up in the Alamo and his history with the famous sandbar fight, which kind of took that knife from, just an everyday knife into American history. So the famous sandbar fight took place with Jim Bowie in 1827 in Mississippi. And kind of the reason it's called the sandbar fight, you can look up into it. I'm not going to go into super big detail, but they fought in the middle of the Mississippi River essentially because, dueling and fighting with knives was frowned upon, and it was kind of the neutral zone, as it were, to settle disputes. He ended up emerging victorious in that fight, severely injured and wounded, but after that fight, the legend of that knife and his legend kind of really took off and spread like a wildfire, and then people all over, they wanted a knife like he used in that. And then, in frontier lore, it moved over into big game hunters, buffalo hunters. It moved over into bear hunters and stuff like that. And so we'll talk about that also a little bit later, but that was kind of how it ended up today. So towards the end, I'm going to break in. I'm going to talk about this knife, and I am going to give you a knife review. But the history behind this style knife is probably not 100% accurate to him. This style came from some TV shows, but I mean, it's in the same genre, but we'll dive into that. The earliest known Bowie knives that people have seen and that are in museums, I have been in tons of frontier museums all across the U.S., from the Rocky Mountains all the way from Montana down into New Mexico. Bowie knives are everywhere in these old museums for the frontier days and the cowboy days. Everyone had one. Quite a bit of people had them. There are some variations on them, but for the most part, they are legendary for ubiquitously an American oversized knife. And honestly, America is known for being boisterous, loud, obnoxious, especially in the frontier days. And this knife, I think, kind of symbolizes that cowboy frontierman mentality of big and boisterous. And that's why this knife, I think, is so popular, because big personalities. So some people say that his brother commissioned him to have the knife built. That's been disputed, but overall, I think that's probably true. They think it was made in Louisiana. There's a lot of, like I said, this knife is an American folklore knife. It's probably the same level of Bigfoot at this point. So as he carried this knife, he had some other feats, between the American-Mexican War, the Indian Wars. The knife just got more and more popular as his, reputation grew. And with Davy Crockett moving down into Texas with Sam Houston, the Alamo, then once they all died at the Alamo, I think that, that's really what spurred it up into just American folklore. So even after the Civil War, Bowie knives remained extremely popular. What also got the catalyst on them, and this is coming from my firsthand experience going to frontier museums, pioneer museums, everyone had one, and it was just a very good popular knife. So even after the Civil War and the migration out west, this knife really took off because it was, people back then, they needed something to fight with, right? They wanted something big, intimidating, practical. And I think this knife, even today, still serves the same intended purpose after, the Civil War. So when people started coming out west, frontier days, they wanted a weapon. They didn't at that time, they didn't carry swords. They didn't carry really daggers. I guess you could say this is an American dagger. So when you're dodging, when you're worried about Indian attacks, you want a survival tool. You're thinking about, bears, mountain lions, big animals, and you want a big knife. I mean, this knife, even if you got attacked by a wild animal, you shove this in a wild animal's gut, a mountain lion, a bear, it's probably going to get off. It's not going to be done too happy. So, really, this serves as like a hand spear in my mind. And for, modern day applications, why do people still buy these? Yeah, well, I'd say number one reason probably is for the nostalgia of it and just the cool factor is why most of them are sold. But even today, you can chop wood, you can process wood. I've had a couple of these. You can baton with them. They're a great survival knife. They're not necessarily a bushcraft knife, but I mean, you could get up on it and do bushcraft task, right? So it still has a modern day application for a defense tool and for just a overall survival tool, right? One thing I really like to do with these Bowie knives is shove them into a log, and you can split wood and fire tinder with them going this way. They work great for that. They're just overall a phenomenal tool to have. So a lot of the other legendary folklore people in history were known to carry these. Wild Bill Hickok was said reportedly to carry one. Jesse James, Buffalo Bill Cody, even Doc Holliday, the famous Doc Holliday, was reported to have one of these at a particular point in time. He did use small boot daggers and stuff because he was a gambler, rambler, gunslinger, so this really wasn't his jam. But, pretty much a lot of these iconic Western cowboy frontiersmen carried these. And if you go to a lot of the museums, if you go to, there is a gun museum, one of the largest gun museums and frontier museums in Cody, Wyoming. I've been there numerous times. They have tons of these in there from frontiersmen. So this wasn't just a hype. A lot of people back in the day, frontiersmen, mountain men, carried these knives. Some of them were longer, almost sword-like. Some are shorter. Some are more narrow. Overall, I think probably the first Bowie knife that Jim Bowie actually had the sandbar fight, a lot of people think it was basically just a cleaver and a kitchen knife that was fashioned. And then the second iteration of it was more of a, fighting knife, frontiersman knife style, right? So it's changed over time, but the idea of a big knife that can tame the West, can tame the wild animals, chop meat up, chop buffalo up, fight bears, fight cougars, fight wars, just an overall American frontiersman knife. It very much lives up to the reputation in the fact that this wasn't just an urban legend or a novelty item. This knife really, I think, formed the Western U.S. in a lot of ways. Even moving in, this knife was used in World War II. Pilots, there's pictures of World War II pilots. They had these knives. They would wear them on like chest rigs, trenchmen. So, this knife stayed alive for a long time. Nowadays, I think a knife like this pretty much lives in closets and display cases, and it's more novelty item. There are people like me. I've had numerous of these throughout the years, and I've still used them. When I went up to Alaska and was poking around up there, I had another Bowie knife, not this one, but I had one that I carried with me because Kodiak bears, right? And brown bears. And so, I think it has still a place in the still wildness of North America. Is it practical for everybody? No. Should you have one? Absolutely yes. They're just fun to have. And I think it is an American legend. And I think if you were going to pick, every culture, Japan has the samurai sword. The Middle East have, some of their curved swords, the Romans. Every culture has some kind of blade that I think, represents them. And I think this is the North American blade that if you're going to pick one blade to represent America and the North American wilderness, all the way down from, you know, Arizona all the way up to Alaska and everywhere in between. I think this is the knife that represents the North American continent and the wilds of North America, just because it is just useful for this area. This is the Condor Undertaker Bowie knife. Some people say Bowie, some people say Bowie. Technically, the real pronunciation is Bowie. Wooden handle, 1075, high carbon steel. You know, not the most expensive steel, but it is, you can sharpen it out in the field very well. Just a great knife. Condor comes with, you know, a leather sheath, fits in there great. You know, my biggest complaint is a lot of companies, and they screw this up with the cross guards. They do have a tendency to rattle and get loose. I think the original Bowie knife probably didn't have a cross guard. From what I can tell, it was more just kind of a little bit of a guard, not a full, I wouldn't say a full-blown cross guard. I would just say it had a small guard on it that was more or less just to keep the bottom of, just enough to just keep your index finger from, you know, going forward when you're jabbing or, you know, you're cutting or whacking something. But overall, I've had 2 of these. This is the second one that I've had, and I've never had one, you know, wiggle or get loose on me. You know, obviously, you're not going to bang on something like an axe. The sheaths on these they're good. Everybody, if you know Condor sheaths, they make good sheaths, but it does not want to go in there too good. Honestly, I wish somebody would make a good aftermarket sheath for these. Just something a little bit bigger. I mean, you do have the strap. See, I'm even struggling on camera to get the strap on. You know, this one's obviously newer. But overall, the sheath is good. Once it breaks in, I think you have more, you'll have more play. But overall, good. This is a good style. Some notable mentions, I say, if you want something more high-end, Case makes a Jim Bowie signature edition knife in some different configurations. That's probably the best quality one, I would say, even above this overall, but they're more expensive and they're more like the Raider military inspired versions, as to where I think this might be a little bit more historically accurate, but not as much. There are some other ones out there that are more historically accurate if you want to go with it. Cold Steel makes some that are, and some other companies, but overall, I don't think there is a one and only Bowie knife that is going to be the copy and paste. I think it's more so it's the idea of the Bowie knife. It is what the Bowie knife represents, and that is American frontiersmen, adventure, you know, mountain men, the knife of men. You know what I'm saying? You got to be a big man to hold this knife. Just a video I wanted to make about this knife and the history behind it and why I love Bowie knives. And yeah, they're not the most practical out there. If you've seen my channel before, if you've been a subscriber, I use bushcraft knives. You know what I'm saying? Small bushcraft knives and hatchets. I don't have a whole lot of fighting knives or defensive knives or whatnot. But I think this is the OG frontiersman knife. And I think everyone should own some iteration of a Bowie knife just for the historical significance of it. And, you know, it's just fun to have. So, all right, guys, hope you like this video. Make sure you hit that like, share, and subscribe for more content. Channel's growing. We appreciate it, and we will see you on the next video. Stay safe.
Oh, run, boys, run for your life. Here comes Jim Bowie with his knife. In most every battle, when the West was young,